Get your trash out of my office, Julian, Ronald sneered. We don't need your overpriced contract. I smiled, packed my bag, and deactivated my personal API key. By Monday morning, 4,200 trucks were frozen at the border, costing them millions. Before we get to that chilly Monday morning in late November, you need to understand how Higgins Freight Logistics worked, and more importantly, how I kept it from falling apart. I am Julian Miller. I'm 51 years old, and for the last 28 years, I have lived and breathed supply chain systems. I don't mean that metaphorically. I spent my nights looking at EDI transaction logs, database indexing tables, and API responses while normal people were sleeping. I joined Higgins Freight back in 2018. At the time, the founder, Harold Higgins, was running a decent regional trucking operation. They had about 150 rigs, a couple of warehouses in Ohio and Michigan, and a dream of handling major cross-border freight between the US and Canada. Harold was a practical man. He knew trucks, he knew drivers, and he knew how to secure contracts with automotive suppliers. What he didn't know was how to make different software programs talk to each other. When you ship auto parts from Ontario to Michigan, time is your worst enemy. If a shipment of steering columns is delayed at the Ambassador Bridge for even 3 hours, an assembly plant in Detroit shuts down. When that happens, the penalties aren't measured in hundreds of dollars. They are measured in tens of thousands of dollars per minute. The key to avoiding those penalties is customs clearance. You have to submit the electronic manifest, the commercial invoices, the harmonized tariff schedule codes, and the carrier details to U.S. Customs and Border Protection long before the truck ever reaches the toll booth. When I arrived, Higgins Freight was doing this manually. Dispatched clerks were literally copy-pasting data from customer emails into the government's automated broker interface. It was slow, prone to errors, and cost a fortune in brokerage fees. Harold hired me as the lead integration architect to build a solution. He offered me a base salary of $180,000, which was decent, but I knew the industry. I knew that if I built a custom system as an employee, the company would own it, and they could toss me aside whenever they pleased. So, before I wrote a single line of code, I made a deal with Harold. I proposed that the integration engine would be built under my personal consulting company, Miller Tech Consulting LLC. I would license the software to Higgins Freight Logistics for a nominal fee of $1,500 a month. The employment contract stated that the license was tied directly to my employment. If I was ever terminated without cause, or if the company defaulted on the licensing fee, the license would terminate immediately, and all proprietary API keys and connection routes would revert to Miller Tech Consulting. If they wanted to own the code permanently, there was a clear buyout clause, $1.5 million. Harold, eager to get the system running and not wanting to pay a massive upfront development fee, signed the contract without blinking. He trusted me, and to be fair, I delivered. For 8 years, I developed and refined what we called the ClearBorder API. It wasn't just a simple script. It was a complex automated routing and clearance engine. It connected Higgins Freight's internal transportation management system directly to the customs brokers, the carriers, and the government portals. When a client booked a shipment, ClearBorder automatically pulled the commercial invoice, verified the tariff codes against a database of 40,000 parts, generated the security filings, and submitted them to customs. It reduced the clearance approval time from 4 hours to under 4 minutes. Because of ClearBorder, Higgins Freight grew exponentially. We went from 150 trucks to a fleet of over 1,200 owner-operators and company rigs. We secured exclusive shipping contracts with 3 major manufacturing giants, bringing in over $120 million in annual revenue. The system ran so smoothly that most people in the office forgot it even existed. They just saw the status lights on their dispatch monitors turn green, and the trucks rolled across the border. I spent my days monitoring the server logs from my quiet corner office on the 3rd floor. I kept my head down, drank my black coffee, and made sure the database queries were optimized. I didn't care about corporate politics. I didn't care about the annual company picnics. I cared about latency. If the API response time crept above 200 milliseconds, I didn't sleep until I found the bottleneck. Then came the summer of 2026. Harold Higgins, who was 59 and feeling the toll of 40 years in the trucking business, decided to take a step back. He didn't sell the company, but he handed the daily operations over to his 32-year-old son, Ronald. Ronald had a prestigious business degree, a wardrobe of custom-tailored suits, and an absolute contempt for the people who actually did the work. He viewed the trucking industry through the lens of spreadsheets and slide decks. To Ronald, a driver wasn't a human being navigating a 40-ton rig through a blizzard. A driver was a variable cost that needed to be minimized. And an integration architect like me was just an expensive line item on the IT department's budget. The moment Ronald took the title of VP of Operations, the atmosphere in the office changed. He brought in two young analysts who had never seen a flatbed trailer in their lives. They spent their days analyzing employee salaries, looking for ways to trim the fat. It didn't take long for their crosshairs to lock onto me. I remember the first time Ronald walked into my office. He didn't knock. He just stood in the doorway, looking around at my dual monitors and the server rack humming in the corner. "Julian," he said, using that patronizing tone that only wealthy young executives can manage. I was looking at the department expenses. "You're pulling down 180 grand, plus we're paying some external entity called Miller Tech Consulting $1,500 a month. What exactly is that for?" "That's the license fee for the Clear Border integration," I replied, not looking up from my terminal. "It's the engine that automates all the customs clearance filings for the fleet." Ronald laughed, a short, dismissive sound. "We have an IT department, Julian. We pay 3 junior developers 60 grand a year. Why are we paying a premium for a system we already run? We can just have them manage it. Or better yet, we can outsource the whole database management to a firm in Manila. My consultants tell me we can cut our IT overhead by 70%. The junior developers don't know the business logic behind the customs API," I said calmly. "And the license is legally owned by my LLC. The contract with your father is very specific about that." Ronald narrowed his eyes. "We'll see about that. My father is old school, Julian. He made a lot of emotional deals. But there's a new regime now. We're going to modernize this place, and that means cutting out the dead weight." I didn't argue. I had seen plenty of guys like Ronald come and go. They think they can rewrite the laws of gravity because they have an MBA. I just turned back to my screen, optimized another SQL index, and waited. I knew exactly what my contract said, and I knew exactly what would happen if he tried to push me out. I had spent 8 years building the cage. If Ronald wanted to walk inside and lock the door behind him, I wasn't going to stop him. By the second week of November, Ronald had his plan fully prepared. I knew this because Nate, one of our junior database administrators, came to my office late one Tuesday evening. Nate was 26, a hard-working kid who actually wanted to learn the architecture. He looked nervous, holding a printed copy of an internal memo that Ronald had drafted for the executive board. "Julian," Nate whispered, closing the door behind him. "You didn't hear this from me, but Ronald is presenting a restructure plan to the board tomorrow. He's telling them they can save $300,000 annually in IT overhead alone. He's listed your salary and the Miller Tech license fee as the primary targets for elimination." I took the memo from him and scanned it. Ronald had written a beautiful corporate document filled with words like efficiency optimization, redundancy reduction, and vendor consolidation. The plan was to outsource the database maintenance and integration support to a third-party IT firm based in Southeast Asia. The transition was scheduled to happen immediately. Ronald claimed that because the Clear Border software had been developed while I was an employee, Higgins Freight Logistics held the intellectual property rights, and they would simply stop paying the monthly licensing fee. "He thinks the code is ours, Julian," Nate said, rubbing his neck. "I tried to tell him that the database connector runs through a secure API gateway hosted on your personal AWS account, but he wouldn't listen. He told me that any software used in this building belongs to the company." "Thank you, Nate," I said, handing the memo back to him. "Don't get yourself caught in the crossfire. Just do your job." The next morning, the board meeting took place. I wasn't invited, but I didn't need to be. I could hear Ronald's loud, confident voice through the glass walls of the conference room down the hall. He was showing slides of cost projections, pointing to red bars that miraculously shrunk into green ones over a 5-year timeline. Harold Higgins, the father, was sitting at the head of the table. He looked tired, occasionally rubbing his temples. I could tell he didn't fully understand the technical details his son was throwing at him, but he trusted his son's business degree. At exactly 2 in the afternoon, my office phone rang. It was Ronald's secretary, asking me to step into the main executive suite. When I walked in, Ronald was sitting behind the large mahogany desk that used to belong to his father. Harold wasn't in the room. Instead, Ronald was flanked by the company's HR manager, a woman named Clara, and his senior operations analyst. "Have a seat, Julian," Ronald said, gesturing to the chair opposite him. He had a stack of folders in front of him, and his face wore the smug expression of a man who believed he had just played a winning chess move. I sat down and remained silent, waiting for him to start. "We're making some changes around here," Ronald began, leaning forward. "As part of our commitment to streamlining operations and reducing unnecessary overhead, we are restructuring the Integration and IT Systems Department. Effective immediately, your position as lead integration architect is being eliminated." He slid a single sheet of paper across the desk. It was a termination letter. "We appreciate your service over the last 8 years." Clara added in a flat, rehearsed voice. "However, due to corporate restructuring, we will not be offering a severance package. Your employment is terminated for redundancy, effective at the end of the day today." I looked at the paper, then looked up at Ronald. "And what about the Clearborder licensing agreement with Miller Tech Consulting?" Ronald smirked, leaning back in his chair. "We are terminating that agreement as well. We won't be paying the $1,500 a month anymore. The software is already installed on our local servers, and our legal team assures us that since you wrote the code while receiving a salary from Higgins Freight, the company owns the system. We don't need to pay a monthly subscription to use our own property." "Did your legal team actually read the contract your father signed in 2018? I asked, my voice completely level. "My father made a lot of informal, loose deals that don't hold up under modern corporate scrutiny," Ronald said dismissively. "We have the code running on our servers. We have the database. We don't need your LLC, and we don't need your overpriced consulting services. We've already contracted with an offshore team to handle the daily API maintenance starting next week. They're costing us a fraction of what you make." "I see," I said. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't get angry. I didn't try to explain to him how the system actually operated. If a man is determined to jump off a cliff, it is not my job to teach him how to fly. "So, you are terminating my employment immediately, and you are refusing to pay the license fee for the software connection." "That is correct," Ronald said, clearly enjoying what he thought was an easy victory. "We'll need you to hand over your security badges and laptop immediately. Clara will escort you to your desk to pack your personal belongings, and then you'll be escorted out of the building. We've already locked your corporate email account." "Understood," I replied. I stood up, signed the acknowledgement of termination without protest, and handed it to Clara. I walked back to my office, under the watchful eye of the HR manager. I packed my leather briefcase with my personal items, my coffee mug, my notebook, and a small brass clock my father had given me. I left the company-owned laptop on the desk. As I was walking down the hallway, I passed Ronald, who was standing near the dispatch floor. He was talking to the shift manager, pointing at the monitors that displayed the live tracking of our 1,200 trucks. "Don't worry about the transition," Ronald was saying loudly. "Everything is automated. The system runs itself." I didn't say a word. I walked out of the building, got into my car, and drove home. The afternoon sun was setting over the industrial parks of Columbus, Ohio. I felt a strange sense of peace. For 8 years, I had carried the entire operational weight of a $120 million logistics company on my shoulders. Now, Ronald had decided he wanted to carry it instead. I was more than happy to let him try. But first, he was going to have to learn the difference between owning a steering wheel and owning the engine. When I got home, I made myself a cup of chamomile tea and sat down at my personal desk in my study. I opened my personal laptop and accessed the secure digital vault, containing the original 2018 licensing agreement between Higgins Freight Logistics and Miller Tech Consulting LLC. I scrolled down to Clause 12, titled Software Licensing and Intellectual Property. The text was clear and unambiguous. It stated, "The license, Higgins Freight Logistics, is granted a non-exclusive revocable license to utilize the ClearBorder API Gateway Connector. This license is contingent upon the active employment of the developer, Julian Miller, as lead integration architect, or the continuous payment of the monthly licensing fee of $1,500. In the event of termination of the developer's employment for any reason other than documented cause, or in the event of non-payment of the licensing fee, this license shall terminate automatically within 24 hours of such event. Upon termination, all rights to access the external integration gateway, the API validation protocols, and the customs clearance routing nodes shall revert solely to the developer." Ronald's legal team had made a classic amateur mistake. They assumed that because the local database wrapper, the software that sat on the office servers in Columbus, was on company property, they owned the entire system. But they didn't understand the system's architecture. The local database wrapper was just a collection terminal. It collected the cargo weight, driver names, vehicle identification numbers, and commercial invoice details from the dispatchers. But that raw data couldn't just be sent to the government. It had to be structured, encrypted, and validated against the U.S. Customs and Border Protection Automated Commercial Environment Portal, as well as the Canada Border Services Agency system. The machine that did that heavy lifting, the actual translator that turned raw shipping data into legally compliant customs filings, didn't live on the Higgins servers. It lived on my personal AWS cloud account hosted under Miller Tech Consulting LLC. Every time a dispatcher clicked clear shipment, the local server sent an encrypted JSON payload to my AWS API gateway. My cloud server validated the payload, signed it with my developer credentials, routed it to the government portals, and returned the official entry numbers and custom barcodes. Without my AWS gateway, the local software was just an expensive typewriter. It could collect data, but it had no way to send it to the border. And because Ronald had officially terminated both my employment and the licensing agreement today, the 24-hour grace period was ticking. I opened my AWS console. I navigated to the security panel for the Higgins integration endpoint. I looked at the traffic logs. Even on a Thursday evening, the system was busy, processing about 40 customs entries per hour. I didn't delete anything. Deleting their data would be illegal, and I had no intention of giving Ronald any leverage in a courtroom. I simply clicked on the active API key configuration, selected the credential token assigned to Higgins Freight Logistics, and hit Disable. Then I stopped the virtual machine instance that ran the proprietary translation algorithms. The endpoint was now offline. Any incoming request from Higgins Freight would receive a standard HTTP 403 forbidden error response. To ensure everything was handled professionally, I set up an automated email responder on my Miller Tech Consulting business email. The message was simple. Please be advised that the ClearBorder API Gateway service has been suspended for Higgins Freight Logistics, effective November 12, 2026, due to contract termination and non-payment of licensing fees. Under the terms of the 2018 licensing agreement, service will remain suspended until a formal buyout of the source code is completed or a new licensing agreement is executed. For inquiries, contact admin@millertech.com. With those few clicks, I closed my laptop, went downstairs, and made dinner. The next day was Friday. I knew the company would survive Friday because of a feature I had built into the local wrapper: database caching. I had designed the local system to cache customs approvals for up to 24 hours to handle temporary internet outages at the office. This meant that any truck that had already been cleared on Thursday would still be able to cross the border on Friday using the cached barcodes. But Friday night was when the weekend shipping rush began. Higgins Freight operated 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Over the weekend, hundreds of shipments of fresh produce from Mexico and automotive parts from Canada would arrive at the hubs. New manifests would have to be generated, and new customs filings would have to be submitted. By Saturday morning, the cache would be completely empty. Every new manifest submission would fail. The local server would try to ping my AWS gateway, receive a 403 error, and the dispatch screens in Columbus would start flashing red. I spent my weekend doing yard work. I raked the autumn leaves in my front yard, cleared the gutters, and went to a local diner for a long, quiet breakfast. I kept my personal phone on my desk at home. I knew that the moment the system failed, the calls would start. I was right. By Saturday afternoon, my personal phone showed 4 missed calls from Nate. I didn't answer. Nate was a good kid, but he couldn't fix this, and I didn't want him to get in trouble for talking to me. By Sunday evening, the missed calls began to multiply. I had 9 missed calls from the Columbus dispatch office, 3 from Clara in HR, and 2 from Ronald himself. I didn't pick up. Under the terms of my contract, I was no longer an employee, and my consulting company was under no obligation to provide technical support for a terminated license. I went to bed early on Sunday night. I knew that Monday morning would bring the real storm, and I wanted to be fully rested to watch the ship go down. On Monday morning, I woke up at 7, made a fresh pot of coffee, and checked the news. In the regional logistics forums, the rumors were already spreading. By 8, the local transportation news sites had headlines about a massive system failure at Higgins Freight Logistics, causing gridlock at the Ambassador Bridge in Detroit and the Peace Bridge in Buffalo. At 9, I opened my laptop and checked the traffic logs on my AWS server. The server was receiving thousands of failed connection attempts per minute from the Higgins local servers. Then, my phone rang again. It was a number I didn't recognize, but I knew the area code. It was Harold Higgins' personal cell phone. I picked up. Julian Miller. Julian. Harold's voice was hoarse. He sounded 10 years older than the last time I saw him. Thank God you picked up. We have a disaster here, Julian. The entire system is down. We've got over 4,000 trucks stuck at the Canadian border and the southern crossings. Customs is refusing to let them through without the API filing numbers. The backing queues are miles long. CBP is threatening to fine us for blocking the plaza lanes. I'm sorry to hear that, Harold, I said, taking a sip of coffee. But as of last Wednesday, I am no longer an employee of Higgins Freight, and the licensing agreement for the Clearborder API was terminated by your VP of Operations. I know, Harold sighed deeply. Ronald told the board that we own the system. He said we could run it without you. He didn't tell me he was going to cut your access off immediately. I didn't find out until this morning when the dispatch floor looked like a war zone. We have our biggest client, a major auto parts supplier, threatening to sue us for $15 million if their shipments don't arrive in Detroit by noon. They've already had to pause their assembly line. Before Harold could finish, I heard the phone being snatched away. Ronald's voice came screeching through the speaker. Julian, you listen to me. Ronald screamed, his voice cracking with panic. You are sabotaging this company. This is illegal. You locked us out of our own system. We are losing $1.8 million a day because of this, and our lawyers are drafting a lawsuit against you right now. We will sue you for every penny you have, Ronald, I said, keeping my voice cold and steady. I suggest you take a deep breath and go read the contract your father signed in 2018. Specifically, Clause 12. I didn't lock you out of your system. Your local servers are running perfectly. What you lack is a license to connect to my LLC's cloud translation engine. You terminated that license. Therefore, I disabled the credentials. I have not accessed your servers, and I have not deleted a single byte of your data. I simply stopped hosting my own intellectual property for a company that refused to pay for it. It's company property. You built it while you were on our payroll, Ronald yelled. I built the database interface wrapper on your payroll, I replied. But the translation engine, the API gateway, and the routing algorithms are registered under Miller Tech Consulting LLC, which I established 2 years before I ever walked into Higgins Freight. Your father signed a lease agreement for that software. You terminated that lease. If you want to use the system, write your own API gateway. You have 3 junior developers and an offshore team, don't you? Have them write a custom customs integration engine. There was a long silence on the other end. I knew what Ronald was realizing. You can't just write a customs integration engine in a day. It takes months of development, testing, and security clearances from the federal government. Every day they spent trying to rebuild it would cost them nearly $2 million in detention fees, truck driver wages, and client penalties. Julian. Harold's voice was back on the phone. He had taken the receiver back from his son. Please, we can't wait months. We can't even wait days. We will go bankrupt by the end of the week if this isn't resolved. What is it going to take to get the gateway turned back on? I will not negotiate with Ronald, I said clearly. He is incompetent, arrogant, and he has no understanding of how this business operates. I will only deal with you, Harold, and I will only deal in writing. I am going to send an email to your personal address with my terms. You have until 12 o'clock today to sign the agreement and wire the funds. If the funds are not in my account by noon, the price doubles. If they aren't there by 5, I delete the AWS server instance entirely, and you can start building your system from scratch. Send the email, Julian, Harold said quietly. We'll be waiting. I hung up. I sat at my laptop and drafted the settlement agreement. I didn't hold back. I knew I had complete leverage. First, I demanded a full buyout of the Clearborder API source code and intellectual property, as specified in the original 2018 contract, for the sum of $1.5 million. Second, I demanded a double multiplier severance package for the termination of my employment without cause. Under Clause 8B of my employment contract, this amounted to 12 months of salary at $15,000 a month, multiplied by 2, totaling $360,000. Third, I required a signed, written statement from the board of directors acknowledging that Miller Tech Consulting LLC had acted in full compliance with all contracts and releasing me from any past, present, or future liabilities related to the system outage. Finally, I added a specific operational clause. Ronald Higgins must be permanently removed from any operations role involving the IT and systems architecture of Higgins Freight Logistics. I checked my watch. It was 10:30. I attached the PDF of the agreement to an email, sent it to Harold's personal address, and closed my laptop. The ball was in their court now. At 11:15, my email dinged. It was a reply from Harold. Attached was a scanned copy of the agreement, signed by Harold Higgins as CEO and attested by the board's corporate secretary. Alongside the agreement was a copy of the wire transfer receipt. Higgins Freight Logistics had authorized a payment of $1,860,000 to the account of Miller Tech Consulting LLC. I opened my business banking app on my phone. I watched the pending transactions. At exactly 11:42, the status changed. The funds had cleared. $1,860,000 sat in my account. Fully settled, I immediately called Nate. Nate, I said when he answered on the first ring. I've just received the signed buyout agreement and the transfer. I'm going to transfer ownership of the AWS root account to you. Do you have your laptop ready? Yes, Julian, I'm ready, Nate said, his voice shaking slightly. The office is a madhouse right now. Ronald is in his room packing his things. Harold just demoted him to an administrative clerk position at our local warehouse, and he's taking back full control of the operations. Harold just appointed me as the new systems administrator. He told me my first task is to make sure you get whatever you need to turn the gateway back on. Good for you, Nate. You deserve the promotion, I said. Now, listen carefully. I am sending you a secure link to transfer the AWS account. Once you accept, you will need to update the API validation tokens. I will walk you through it. For the next 15 minutes, I guided Nate through the process of taking control of the AWS infrastructure. We migrated the domain registration, updated the billing profiles to Higgins Freight's corporate accounts, and spun the virtual machine instance back up. At 11:55, I clicked the final button on my side, officially releasing my administrative access. Okay, Nate, I said. Check your console. The service is active. The database wrapper should be able to authenticate now. In the background of the call, I could hear a sudden cheer go up from the dispatch floor down the hall. It's working, Nate shouted over the noise. The logs are rolling. The first batch of customs clearance numbers just came back. The queue is processing at 500 entries a minute. The trucks at the Detroit border are already moving. Excellent, I said. The system is yours now, Nate. I've left full documentation in the Route S3 bucket. If you follow the indexing guidelines I wrote, the database won't give you any trouble. Good luck. Thank you, Julian. For everything, Nate said. I hung up the phone. I leaned back in my chair and took a deep breath. The quiet of my study was a sharp contrast to the chaos that had just consumed Higgins Freight Logistics. By Monday afternoon, the crisis was officially over. The 4,000 trucks had cleared customs, and the assembly lines in Detroit remained open, though the company had to pay some hefty late fees and detention costs, but they survived. Harold had saved his family business, though it had cost him nearly $2 million in a single morning to correct his son's arrogance. As for Ronald, his corporate career was effectively over. He couldn't put modernized logistics operations on his resume when his first week in charge resulted in a near bankruptcy and a forced buyout. I heard later that he eventually left the company entirely, unable to face the managers and dispatchers who knew exactly how he had frozen the entire network. I sat in my study looking at my bank balance, $1,860,000. In the logistics business, we talk a lot about critical paths, the sequence of stages determining the minimum time needed for an operation. In my career, the critical path was always about protecting my work. I had spent 8 years building a system that was so integrated, so vital, that the company couldn't survive 24 hours without it. And I had made sure that the legal contracts protected that value. Ronald thought he was playing a high-stakes corporate game where he could just discard employees like depreciated assets. He thought his corporate title gave him absolute power. But he forgot that in the modern world, power isn't about the title on your door. It's about who controls the flow of information. I didn't need to scream. I didn't need to make threats. I just had to stand aside and let the rules of the system I built enforce themselves. I closed my laptop and walked out onto my porch. The air was crisp, and the autumn wind was blowing the remaining leaves off the maple trees. I had no servers to monitor, no latency issues to patch, and no corporate executives to placate. I was 51 years old, financially independent, and completely free. It was time to plan my next move. But first, I think I'll take a very long vacation.